Hey guys, this is JP again, and in this video I want to do two things. I want to present panpsychism, and together with it a few arguments that explain why it's being experiencing a resurgence right now, why it's a popular solution to the mind-body problem, why it's promising basically. So just quickly put, the basic idea of panpsychism is that the fundamental particles, or at least some very small constituents of matter, are conscious. Obviously, those small particles, let's say, would have consciousnesses that are much simpler than our own. So let's say the fundamental particles that make up my brain, for instance, they have something that is like to be them. It feels like something. It's obviously very simple. No panpsychist really today thinks that my neurons, let's say my fundamental particles and so on, have complex consciousnesses, but they have a simple one. And the idea is that by combining those simple consciousnesses, they could combine into more and more complex consciousnesses. So the fundamental particles in my brain create more complex consciousnesses when they combine into molecules and proteins and cells and so on, until you get to my brain, where you would have my consciousness as a whole. And by the way, I'm talking about the brain right now, but maybe the physical basis of consciousness is different. Maybe it's not just the brain, maybe it's the body, and maybe it's the body plus the environment. But generally in this video, I'll be talking just about the brain, just for sake of simplicity. You can extend the arguments to larger entities than just the brain, but for today, I'm basically just going to talk about the brain. So let's talk about a few arguments why this idea of panpsychism seems to be very promising. The first one is the elegance of physics, the elegance with physics, actually, because that's a point that was made by a few British philosophers of science about 100 years ago, Arthur Eddington and Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, for instance, which tells you that actually physics is as an empty ontology, or to put it more precisely, it only describes its entities extrinsically, meaning that, for instance, and the way you know any particle in physics is by its behavior. You know that it follows such and such laws, but you don't know why it follows those laws, and you don't know what that particle is fundamentally. So let's say I tell you that an electron has this mass, this charge, and it follows these equations. By telling you that, all I know really is how the electron behaves with respect to other particles. Because it has this mass, you plug this in this equation and you get this behavior. Because it has this charge, you put it in this equation, you get this behavior. Ultimately, you never really know what charge is, what mass is, and what the electron is. And that's true for all the entities of physics. So if you start with the fundamental particles, then you go to, let's say, atoms, all the levels up until you get, let's say, neurons, to all brains. All that physics can really tell you about those things is that how they behave, not how they are really themselves. So let's say a physicist could look at me and tell me that, well, JP, what you are is this set of particles which follow these laws, and that explains your entire behavior. Well, that's kind of true, but it doesn't really tell me what I am, and doesn't even really tell me the reasons why I act, per se. Because let's say I get up today and I go get a coffee. Well, the physicist can tell me, well, you got this coffee because you follow this law, because you're made up of these particles. But that's not really as good an explanation, in my opinion, as just saying that, well, I wanted coffee. I had a phenomenal desire of coffee. In my consciousness, I wanted coffee, and that's why I moved. What happens here is that the physicist is describing the behavior, describing things extrinsically, while there is a consciousness that is intrinsically filling up that entity. So a way of saying it is that physics describes things extrinsically, and if you want to fill that ontological void, you need an intrinsic entity, and we have a good candidate for that intrinsic entity, namely phenomenal consciousness. So the idea in panpsychism is that this would hold true at every level. So there would be phenomenal consciousnesses at the level of neurons, at the level of atoms, at the level of fundamental particles, and so on. There would always be a correspondence between some consciousness and some entity described extrinsically by physics. And depending obviously on how those fundamental consciousnesses combine, then they would sometimes be conscious and sometimes not. So let's say if I take the table I'm standing in front of right now, panpsychists would generally say that the table as a whole is not conscious, that only its fundamental particles are. And what happens, in the table is that the consciousnesses, maybe if you get to a certain level, they cancel out or they just don't combine. Whereas in my case, my fundamental consciousnesses combine into my consciousness, GP. So that's the basic idea. The first argument why panpsychism is popular right now is that it fills the void in the ontology of physics, and it's very elegant. Another argument for panpsychism is that it avoids the causal closure of the physical argument. So that's an argument that is generally used for physicalism. The idea is that, well, if you look at the laws of physics that describe those entities, they don't seem to leave any room for anything else. Namely that if you look at the laws that hold for fundamental particles, they describe the behavior of fundamental particles, and ultimately the behavior of all other entities need to be reducible to the behaviors of those fundamental particles. If you know a way of putting it is that the behavior of brains cannot change without the behavior of fundamental particles changing. Something needs to be changed. Something needs to change at this level for anything to change at this level, and there is no room for anything else. The behavior of everything is determined, even if statistically, because today we know because of quantum mechanics that there are probabilities involved at the level of fundamental particles. But the probabilities at every level would be described by the probabilities at this lower level. So this means that concretely, traditionally, what the argument against dualism and basically the argument for physicalism is that, well, for consciousness to be causally efficacious, it needs to be reduced to physics, because all the causality in physics is explained physically. If you want to explain how atoms move, ultimately it's a matter of how fundamental particles move. If you want to explain how my behavior happens physically, why my body moves, why I move to go get some coffee, you can find a physical explanation. And you never need to get out of this physical system, so there's no room for consciousness in there. There's no room for my desire. So the argument goes. But that's an argument that that panpsychism can rebut, because, well, actually physics does not really tell you the reasons. It tells you the behavior, but it never tells you the reasons. If you want to know the reasons, the real causes of things, you need to look at the consciousness side of things. So as I said earlier about my desire for coffee, for instance, well, it's not really a good explanation to say that I wanted coffee because I follow these laws. It's really more that the reason why I follow these laws is that the laws describe my desire. They describe what the output of my behavior following my conscious decisions. So the causal closure of the physical argument is avoided by panpsychism. A quick way of putting it is that physics tells you the behavior of things, the extrinsic behavior. If you want to know the real reasons of things, you need to look at the consciousness side. So the real causality is occurring at this level, whereas the physical side of causality is only describing things extrinsically. The next argument is the argument against emergence, because a really neat way of seeing a really neat thing with panpsychism is that there's no place where consciousness suddenly appears in our ontology or in evolution, and that's a very annoying thing for other positions which want to take consciousness seriously, meaning that they admit that, well, consciousness is not just physics, that physicalism is wrong, but still you need to find a place, a minimal point in this tree where okay, it's at this level that consciousness happens, and it's at this place in evolution where it occurs. So let's say if you want to say that only, but it's at the level of the brain that there is consciousness, for instance, well, then you need to say that, well, there's no consciousness in fundamental particles, atoms, and so on, not even in neurons, but suddenly there's consciousness in brains at this point. And this just seems magical. There's no reason why it would happen there. And it's even more complicated if you look at evolution, because, well, it means that for billions of years, before there were brains, there was all kinds of unconscious matter, and at some point, for no apparent reason, consciousness appeared, evolution let it happen, but we don't really know why this magical entity appeared. So it's much more elegant to say, like panpsychists, that what occurred is that there was consciousness, very simple, from the beginning of the universe. As soon as the Big Bang occurred, there was some consciousness, and all that occurred was that this consciousness was molded by, those consciousnesses were molded by evolution. They became more or less complex depending on the organism or the entity, but at least you have a way to explain without magic why this is conscious, let's say. So that's the last argument I wanted to present for panpsychism. Those really are the three main ones. The fact that it's very elegant with physics, it fills the void left by physics. The argument that it avoids the causal closure argument, and also the fact that it doesn't require emergence. And I want to finish just by giving you a quick upshot as far as the meaning crisis goes. A really cool thing with panpsychism is that it puts us back really into the fabric of the world. We're not alienated, being the only conscious entities in the world. We're deeply enmeshed in the world. We're not, as it were, separated from the world, where there's a physics that describes almost everything, but somehow we humans are different, or very different. It also gives us back agency, because now our consciousnesses actually matter as far as our behavior goes. It's not just described by physics. The real reasons behind the behaviors we describe with physics are conscious. So it gives us our agency back. So those are really cool upshots as far as the meaning crisis goes. We get back our agency, and we get back integrated neatly with the fabric of the world. So thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.